twist. The love that shouldn't exist. Emma and Daniel's romance was the kind that felt predestined. From their first meeting at a quiet little bookshop to long nights spent sharing dreams, every moment felt like a fairy tale. They were perfect, for each other, until the past shattered everything. Emma had always lived under the shadow of tragedy. When she was a child, her father, a devoted journalist, was murdered while investigating a corporate scandal that had cost hundreds of lives. The culprit had never been caught, and Emma had spent years searching for answers, chasing a ghost that had torn her family apart. One evening, as she and Daniel sorted through old records for an upcoming charity event, she stumbled upon a faded newspaper clipping, one she knew well. It was an article detailing her father's death. A photo accompanied it, a grainy image of the prime suspect, whose face had been blurred. But the name beneath it was clear: Philip Carter, Daniel's father. Panic clawed at Emma's throat as she turned to Daniel, but he had already gone pale, his hands trembling over the same revelation. "Emma!" His voice was barely a whisper. "I didn't know. I swear." Her world collapsed in an instant. The man she loved, the one who had made her believe in happiness again, was the son of the man who had destroyed her life. But the horror didn't end there, because as she dug deeper in the days that followed, another secret unraveled. Daniel had known all along. He hadn't just stumbled into her life, he had sought her out. At first, to make amends for his father's sins, but somewhere along the way, he had fallen in love. And now, torn between love and betrayal, Emma had to decide. Was their love stronger than the past, or had it all been built on a lie too devastating to forgive? The love that shouldn't exist. Part 2. Emma's hands trembled as she held the faded newspaper, her father's face staring up at her, forever frozen in time. The article's ink was smudged from age, but she knew the story by heart. A whistleblower, journalist silenced before he could expose the truth, a murderer who had vanished into the shadows, and now, his son, standing in front of her, looking at her like she was the only thing that mattered. Her stomach twisted. Had he known? The words echoed in her mind, a vicious loop that drowned out the sound of her own heartbeat. "Say something," Daniel pleaded. His voice was raw, desperate. Emma took a step back. "Did you know?" He opened his mouth, then closed it. His silence was the answer she feared. A choked sob escaped her lips as she turned away, the weight of betrayal pressing down on her. "How long, Daniel?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "How long have you known who I was?" "I didn't want to lie," he said, stepping forward. "I found out months after we met. I wanted to tell you, but I was afraid. Afraid you'd look at me like you are right now." His voice cracked, thick with emotion. "Like I'm him." Emma whirled around. "You should have told me the second you knew. You should have let me choose whether I wanted to love you, knowing this." "I didn't choose my father, Emma." Daniel's voice was louder now, more frantic. "And I sure as hell didn't choose to love you. It just happened." Emma wiped at her tears furiously. "You think that changes anything? My father died chasing the truth. And you spent months lying to me about the biggest truth of my life." Daniel took a shaky breath. "I didn't lie. I didn't want it to define us. I was trying to fix what he did. To make sure you—" He stopped himself. She froze. "Make sure I what?" His gaze flickered, and in that split second she saw it. Guilt. Not just over his father's sins, over something else. Emma's stomach twisted. "What did you do, Daniel?" His hands clenched into fists at his sides. "I started looking into it." A chill ran down her spine. "Into what?" "Into the case. My father's disappearance." "Emma, what if he's still alive?" The air left her lungs. For years, she had believed Philip Carter was dead, or at the very least, buried so deep in corruption that he would never resurface. But if Daniel was right, if his father was still out there, watching, waiting, Emma took a step back, her entire world unraveling. The love of her life had not only hidden the truth, he had reopened the nightmare. And somewhere, in the dark corners of the past, his father was waiting. The love that shouldn't exist. Part 3. Emma's vision blurred as her breath came in short, ragged gasps. Philip Carter might be alive. The name itself was a curse, a ghost that had haunted her since childhood. And now, standing in front of her, the man she had trusted most in the world had just admitted to waking that ghost up. Daniel stepped forward, his hands raised like he could somehow undo what had just been said. Emma, listen to me. I had to know. I had to find out if he was really dead. If he... You should have told me, she cut in, voice trembling. You should have let me decide if I wanted to go digging through the past. But instead you... She swallowed hard. You did it behind my back. Because I love you, Daniel's voice cracked. I couldn't stand the idea of being with you and pretending none of it mattered. I needed to know the truth, Emma. I needed to know if my father was responsible for your father's death. A bitter laugh escaped her lips. Are you seriously standing here, acting like there was a possibility he wasn't? Daniel clenched his jaw. I don't want to believe that the man who raised me was a monster. She felt her chest tighten. Then what does that make me? Because I've spent my whole life believing that he was. Silence stretched between them like a chasm too wide to cross. Then Daniel exhaled sharply and reached into his jacket, pulling out a folded sheet of paper. I found something, he said quietly. Something you need to see. Emma hesitated before snatching it from his hands. She unfolded it, her eyes scanning the document, and then her breath caught in her throat. It was an old, classified report, a forensic audit from the company her father had been investigating. But one line, in particular, made her knees go weak. Subject, Philip Carter status, disappeared, last seen, March 2009. Reported by R. Halloway. She blinked. R. Halloway. That was her father's editor, the last person who had spoken to him before. He died. The same man who had warned her family never to dig too deep. Emma's grip tightened around the page. Where did you get this? Daniel hesitated. I hired someone. A private investigator. Her pulse pounded in her ears. And you didn't think to tell me? I didn't want to get your hopes up or put you in danger, he said, voice pained. But there's more, Emma. She shook her head. I don't want more, Daniel. I want the truth. He hesitated before speaking, voice barely above a whisper. I think my father killed someone else to disappear. And I think your father was getting too close to finding out. The room tilted. Emma staggered back. You're saying? Daniel swallowed hard. I think my father faked his own death, and I think he killed someone to do it. Emma's heart thundered in her chest. This was more than betrayal. This was more than just an old tragedy resurfacing. Her father had died chasing the truth. And now Daniel had led her straight to it. A single, terrifying thought settled in her mind. If Philip Carter was still alive, then he knew she was looking for him. The love that shouldn't exist. Part 4. Emma's fingers clenched around the paper as if squeezing it would somehow force the truth to be less horrifying. But it was all there, in black and white. A record of her father's last investigation. A name she had spent years cursing, and a terrifying implication she could no longer ignore. Philip Carter wasn't just alive. He had killed to disappear. And now, thanks to Daniel, he knew she was looking for him. A shiver ran down her spine. Daniel, she whispered, barely able to speak the words. Did anyone else see this? The investigator you hired? Daniel's face darkened. I don't know, he admitted. I haven't been able to reach him for days. Emma's stomach twisted. What if he's already dead? Daniel's expression was unreadable, but the tension in his jaw told her he had thought the same thing. The silence between them grew suffocating. Then a noise, a faint thud from outside the apartment door. Emma stiffened. Daniel turned sharply. Toward the sound, his entire body tensing. He reached for the nearest thing that could serve as a weapon, a heavy lamp on the side table. Did you tell anyone we were meeting here? Emma whispered. Daniel shook his head. His grip on the lamp tightened. Oh, second thud, and then the doorknob rattled. Emma's pulse pounded so violently she thought she might faint. Whoever was on the other side wasn't knocking. They were trying to get in. She and Daniel exchanged a single terrified glance before he sprang into action. He grabbed Emma's wrist and yanked her toward the balcony. We have to go. Now. Emma barely had time to react as he slid the door open, ushering her outside into the cold night air. They were on the 3rd floor, too high to jump, too exposed. To stay! The doorknob twisted again, then suddenly, silence. Emma's breath hitched. Whoever was inside the apartment. They had made it in. Daniel pulled her close, his voice a whisper against her ear. Stay behind me. But Emma barely heard him. Her thoughts were a whirlwind. Was it Philip Carter, someone sent by him? Or worse, had Daniel led her into a trap all along? She didn't know what was more terrifying, the idea that Philip Carter was alive, or the possibility that she had fallen in love with someone who had been guiding her toward him all along. Then, a voice, low, smooth, and far too familiar. Hello, Emma. Her blood ran cold. She turned slowly and stared straight into the face of a ghost. Philip Carter was standing in her living room. The love that shouldn't exist. Part 5. Emma's breath hitched. Every muscle in her body locked as she stared at the man before her. Philip Carter. He looked older, but not frail. His face had weathered time with sharp, calculating eyes and a cruel smirk that sent ice through her veins. His hair had grayed at the temples, but there was no mistaking him. The man who had disappeared. The man who had murdered her father. The man she had spent her life hating. Daniel stepped in front of her instinctively, lamp still gripped in his hands like a desperate weapon. Stay back, he warned, voice low and trembling with barely restrained fury. Philip laughed, a slow, deliberate chuckle. Relax, son. I'm not here to hurt her. His eyes flicked to Emma, and a smirk tugged at his lips. I just wanted to see her face when she finally realized the truth. Emma forced herself to breathe, to stay upright when her legs screamed to collapse beneath her. You're supposed to be dead, she rasped. Philip tilted his head. Am I? Hatred bubbled up inside her. You killed my father. Philip sighed, as if she had stated something trivial. Your father didn't know when to stop. He got too close, and unfortunately, that made him an obstacle. He took a step forward, but Daniel moved in front of Emma again, blocking his path. Philip's eyes landed on his son, and his smirk deepened. Look at you, Danny. You really thought you were in control of this, didn't you? Daniel's grip tightened around the lamp. Shut up. All that digging, all that searching, thinking you were one step ahead. Philip chuckled. But you were never ahead. You were exactly where I wanted you. Emma's stomach churned. What the hell are you talking about? Philip's gaze shifted to her. You really think Daniel found me? His eyes glinted. No, sweetheart. I let him. The world tilted. Emma's breath caught. Daniel froze beside her. That's not possible, he said, but his voice wavered. Philip smiled. Did you really think it was a coincidence that the investigator you hired just happened to find old records no one else could? That the paper trail you followed led straight to me? He leaned in slightly. You didn't find me, son. I led you here. I let you think you were the one uncovering the truth. Emma's mind reeled. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't fate. Philip Carter had orchestrated this from the beginning. The horror in Daniel's face was unmistakable. Why? He whispered. Why go through all of this? Philip's smirk faded, replaced by something colder. Because I needed to know if you had it in you, he said. If you were weak like your mother, or if you were strong like me. Daniel flinched, as if he had been slapped. Philip turned back to Emma. And as for you... He stepped closer, his eyes drinking in the sight of her like a man savoring a final masterpiece. I wanted to see the moment you realized the truth. Emma's hands clenched into fists. What truth? She spat. Philip smiled. That this little love story of yours? His eyes flicked between her and Daniel. It was never real. It was never yours. Emma's pulse pounded. You're lying. Philip's smile widened. Aren't I? His gaze darkened, his voice dropping to a whisper that sent ice through her veins. Or did I just prove that fate never belonged to either of you? The love that shouldn't exist. Part 7 Emma's heart pounded against her ribs. The air between them was thick, suffocating, as she stared at Daniel, waiting for him to say something, anything, that would make this nightmare go away. But his silence spoke louder than any confession. Daniel, she whispered, barely able to form the words. What did you do? He swallowed hard, his hands shaking at his sides. I was trying to protect you. Philip let out a dark chuckle. Is that what you call it? He tilted his head, his gaze gleaming with cruel amusement. Tell her, Danny. Tell her how far you were willing to go for love. Emma felt sick. Daniel. Daniel squeezed his eyes shut. His whole body was trembling now. The private investigator, he said, his voice hollow. He found out too much. Emma's breath caught in her throat. Daniel lifted his head slowly, his eyes glistening with something broken. He was going to tell you everything. About your father, about mine, about... His voice cracked. About me. The floor seemed to disappear beneath her feet. Philip grinned, delighted. Go on, say it. Daniel's voice dropped to a whisper. So, I stopped him. Emma's pulse thundered in her ears. I didn't mean to, Daniel said quickly, eyes desperate. I needed him to wait, to give me time to figure out how to tell you everything, but he wouldn't stop digging. He wouldn't listen. He took a shaky breath. So I met him. I told him to back off. He refused. Philip leaned in slightly, watching the scene unfold like it was his favorite show. And then, Daniel's hands curled into fists. Then, I lost control. Emma stumbled back a step, her vision blurring. No, she whispered. Daniel's lips trembled. Emma, please. It wasn't supposed to happen like that. I just pushed him. I didn't know he'd fall. I didn't know... His voice broke. Emma's world spun. You killed him. Daniel sucked in a breath. I tried to save him, but it was too late. His voice cracked with something raw and desperate. I buried the truth because I knew. I knew. If you found out, you'd never look at me the same way again. Emma's chest tightened. She couldn't breathe. Philip let out a satisfied sigh, as if admiring a masterpiece. And there it is, he murmured. The truth, in all its ugly little pieces. Emma barely heard him. The man she loved, the man she had trusted, had killed someone. And he had hidden it from her. Daniel's voice was shaking. Emma, I swear to you, I did it for us, for you. She let out a hollow laugh, but it sounded more like a sob. For me? Tears burned at the corners of her eyes. Everything was a lie. Everything. Philip. smirked. Well, that was even more satisfying than I expected. He turned toward Daniel. I told you, son, we're not so different after all. Daniel whipped around, fury flashing in his eyes. I am nothing like you, Philip arched a brow. Aren't you? He gestured toward Emma. Because she looks at you the same way she looks at me now. Daniel flinched like he had been struck. Philip chuckled, shaking his head. You spent all this time thinking you were the good guy, didn't you? Thinking you could fix things. But in the end, you're exactly what I always knew you'd be. Daniel's breathing grew uneven, his fists trembling at his sides. Tell me, Danny, Philip mused. Now that she knows the truth, what are you going to do? A long, heavy silence filled the room. Emma could see the war inside Daniel. Guilt, rage, fear, love, and something darker. Philip saw it too. He smiled. Because you only have two options, son. His voice dropped to a whisper. You let her go, or you make sure she can't. Emma's breath hitched. Daniel turned to her. His eyes were filled with so much pain it nearly broke her. Nearly. Because underneath it all, there was something terrifying. Hesitation, a single moment where he didn't know what he was about to do. Emma's pulse roared in her ears. Run! She bolted. Daniel cursed. Emma, wait! She didn't wait. She sprinted toward the door, her hands fumbling to unlock it. A hand grabbed her wrist. Emma, don't touch me! She screamed, twisting out of his grip. Daniel's face twisted with anguish. Please, I can fix this. Philip let out a soft chuckle. Ah, love. Emma turned to Daniel, her chest rising and falling in sharp, uneven gasps. You already broke it, she whispered. For a split second, she saw something shatter in his expression, and then she ran. She tore through the doorway, ignoring Daniel's desperate voice behind her, ignoring Philip's dark laughter, ignoring the way her heart was breaking into 1,000 jagged pieces. She didn't stop. She couldn't. Because Philip. Carter had been right about one thing. There were no heroes in this story, only villains. The love that shouldn't exist. Part 8 Emma ran. Her pulse thundered in her ears, drowning out Daniel's frantic voice as he shouted after her. The cold night air bit at her skin as she burst down the apartment stairwell, her only thought, escape. But Daniel was faster. She heard his footsteps pounding behind her, closing in too quickly. Emma, please! His voice cracked, raw with desperation. Just listen to me. She hit the last flight of stairs and stumbled into the dimly lit parking lot. The moment her feet touched the pavement, she turned toward the nearest street. But a hand grabbed her arm. No! She screamed, twisting violently, trying to wrench free. But his grip was firm, not rough, not forceful, just desperate. Daniel's breathing was ragged. His hands shook as he held on to her, his eyes wild with emotion. Just stop running, he pleaded. I'm not going to hurt you. Emma's chest heaved. I don't believe you. Daniel flinched like she had slapped him. For a moment, the only sound between them was their heavy, uneven breaths. And then, Emma. His voice broke. I love you. The words cut through her like a blade. She believed him, and that was the most terrifying part. You killed someone, she whispered, her voice shaking. You lied to me. Daniel's face twisted in pain. I didn't mean to. You covered it up. Her voice cracked, tears burning at her eyes. You let me love you when you knew. She choked on the words. When you knew what you did. Daniel swallowed hard. I was trying to tell you. I didn't know how. Emma shook her head violently, ripping her arm away from his grasp. You had a choice, and you chose to keep it from me. Daniel's expression shattered. Because I was afraid of losing you. Emma's breath caught. He took a shaky step forward. You're the only good thing I have left, Emma. The only thing that wasn't a lie. His voice was raw. "I love you." She stared at him, her heart breaking apart, and she knew. This wasn't just about the past anymore. This was about right now, because she saw it in his eyes, that hesitation, that split second where he didn't know if he should let her go or stop her from leaving. A lump rose in her throat. She forced herself to step back. "If you love me," she whispered, "then let me go." Daniel's breath hitched. His hands trembled at his sides. Emma held her breath. Please. For one agonizing moment, she thought he wouldn't. Then, his shoulders slumped. He exhaled shakily, eyes filling with something so broken, so devastated, that for a second she almost forgot what he had done. And then, "Run," he whispered. Emma's heart pounded. "Before I change my mind," Daniel choked out, his voice barely audible. "Just run." She didn't hesitate. She turned, and she ran, faster than she ever had before. She didn't stop, didn't look back, didn't dare slow down, not until she was far enough away that she could no longer hear his voice. Not until the night swallowed her whole, and for the first time, Emma realized this wasn't the end of their story. It was just the beginning of something far more dangerous. The Love That Shouldn't Exist, Part 9. Emma didn't stop running until her legs burned and her chest ached. The city lights blurred around her, the night air slicing against her skin. She had no plan, no destination. Only one thought echoed. In her mind, I have to get away from him. From Daniel. From the man she had loved. From the man she no longer recognized. She finally stumbled to a stop near an all-night diner, hands trembling as she reached for her phone. She needed help. But who could she even call? The police? Her breath hitched. She could already imagine the headlines. Fallen hero's daughter exposes lover's crime. A tragic, poetic scandal. But would they even believe her? Would she believe herself? Her father had already been tangled in a web of secrets, and now she was caught in it too. Her fingers hovered over the screen. She needed a moment to think, to breathe, before making a choice that would change everything. Then, suddenly, a notification flashed across her phone. Unknown number. "Emma, don't go home." Her stomach lurched, her pulse pounded as she stared at the message. Then, another. Unknown number. "They know what you found. They're coming for you." Emma's breath hitched. Who? Her phone vibrated again. Unknown number. "I can help you. Meet me at the pier. Midnight." Emma's grip tightened on the device. This had to be a trick, a trap. But her gut told her something else, that whatever she had just uncovered ran deeper than she had ever imagined. And now she was in the middle of it. Slowly, she exhaled. She had two choices: call the police and let them take it from here. Go to the pier and find out the truth for herself. She made her decision. With one last glance over her shoulder, Emma turned and disappeared into the night. The Love That Shouldn't Exist. Part 11. Emma's body went cold. The words much bigger echoed in her mind, spinning like a storm. Her instincts screamed at her to turn and run, but the truth was, she couldn't escape now. The web had already caught her, and it was pulling her deeper with every step. She stared at the investigator, this man who shouldn't be alive, who had been the catalyst to unraveling the nightmare that was her life now. "You know about my father," she said, her voice a thread of fear. "You know what happened to him?" The man nodded, his gaze steady. "I know more than you realize." Her pulse quickened. "What happened to him?" she demanded, her voice thick with anxiety. "Why did he die? Why was he murdered?" The investigator's face twisted with something dark. "He wasn't murdered, Emma. Your father wasn't killed by Philip Carter or anyone else for that matter." Emma felt like the ground was falling out from under her. "What do you mean?" What are you saying? The investigator's eyes flickered to the water, his voice low, as if he were choosing his words carefully. Your father wasn't just another journalist, poking around. He was part of something far more dangerous than you realize. He paused, studying her. He was trying to expose a criminal network that went much higher than even Carter. Emma's mind spun. What criminal network? Your father was investigating a group that wasn't just involved in petty crime. It was... He hesitated. A conspiracy that ties back to government corruption, organized crime, and a decades-long cover-up of illegal operations. Her body went numb. You're saying my father wasn't just a journalist, he was a whistleblower? The investigator gave a curt nod. He had information. Information that would have brought down some of the most powerful people in the country. Emma's stomach twisted. This was more than just a murder. It was a cover-up. And she had been living in the dark, wrapped up in this lie her entire life. Why did you disappear? Why didn't you go to the police? She asked, her voice trembling. Why did you let Daniel believe you were dead? The investigator's face hardened, eyes clouded with something dark and bitter. I couldn't, because I was in danger too. He met her gaze, his voice low. And I couldn't risk losing what little I had left. So I faked my own death, went into hiding, and tried to gather the pieces of what your father had uncovered before it was too late. Emma swallowed hard. And Daniel? The investigator's eyes softened with a knowing sadness. He didn't know. He couldn't. Not until it was too late. Emma shook her head. What do you mean? What do you mean it's too late? The investigator took a step forward, lowering his voice. I'm telling you, Emma, this goes deeper than just your father and Daniel. This is bigger than both of them. Philip Carter isn't just some crime lord. He's part of a much larger network. The reason why he needed your father silenced was because your father had discovered the link. He had found out that Carter was a small cog in a system that went all the way to the top. Emma's heart raced. Then why come to me? Why now? Because you're the key. The investigator's eyes flickered with a mix of urgency and grim resignation. Your father didn't just die to protect his secrets. He died to protect you. Her breath caught in her throat. What do you mean? You've inherited the information your father hid, the investigator continued. And now, those who were part of the network, those who need you silenced, are coming after you. Emma's knees felt weak. Who's coming after me? The investigator's eyes darkened, his voice dropping to a near whisper. I can't say their names, but they're everywhere. They have eyes on you. They've been watching ever since you started digging. He stepped closer, his expression intense. That's why I warned you earlier. You have no idea how deep this goes, but the moment you took that first step into your father's world, you became a target. Emma staggered back, her mind reeling. But Daniel, he's not part of this, is he? The investigator shook his head slowly. No, but he was involved in something that might tie him to it. What do you mean? She whispered, barely able to breathe. He was your father's greatest weakness, the investigator said, his voice full of regret. Daniel was being groomed to take over for your father, unwittingly perhaps. But once your father was gone, Daniel was left with a dangerous piece of the puzzle. That's why Carter wanted him close. Daniel could have been a tool or a threat. A cold chill ran through her. So Daniel didn't know the truth? Not at first, the investigator said. But when he found out, he tried to protect you the only way he knew how. By hiding everything, even from you. Emma's head spun. But he lied to me. He killed the investigator. The investigator's expression softened. You don't understand. Daniel didn't kill him. He thought he did. It was a mistake. The love that shouldn't exist. Part 12. The investigator's grip was firm as he helped her to her feet, his eyes scanning the darkness around them. The wind picked up, making the air feel colder, but it wasn't just the chill that made Emma shiver. It was the weight of what was unfolding, the truth about her father, the dangerous web that entangled her life, and the broken man she still loved. Her mind was a maelstrom. She had trusted Daniel with everything. But now she was questioning everything. The investigator's voice broke through her thoughts. "We have to move quickly." He looked around, as if sensing danger in the air. "There's a safe house not far from here. We need to get there before they notice you're missing." Emma hesitated, her heart aching. "But, Daniel..." His face softened, but his voice was blunt. "He's not your concern right now. But you don't understand. It's not just about you anymore, Emma. You're in a war you didn't choose. And as much as I know you still care for him, Daniel's tangled in it too. And if you're not careful, you'll be dragged under with him." Her breath hitched as the weight of his words settled in. Could she walk away from him? Could she truly leave Daniel behind, knowing what she now knew? But the investigator was right. She couldn't keep running back to him, not when the stakes were this high. She nodded slowly. "Okay." Without another word, they started walking toward the shadows at the far end of the pier. Her heart raced with every step, each one feeling like a betrayal. But the truth was, she didn't know who to trust anymore, not even Daniel. The investigator led her down a narrow alley, the sound of their footsteps muffled by the thick fog that clung to the streets. He didn't speak again until they reached a rusted gate at the end of the alley. "This way," he said, unlocking it with a small key from his coat pocket. The gate creaked open, revealing a dark, abandoned building on the other side. Emma followed him through the gate, her senses heightened, every nerve screaming that danger was near. Inside, the building smelled of dust and neglect, and the walls were covered in peeling paint. It was a stark contrast to the polished, chaotic world she had just left behind, the one with its lies, its secrets, and its dead bodies. "This is a temporary hideout," the investigator said, his voice low. "I've been working on this for a while. They won't find you here right away." Emma barely heard him. Her mind was on one thing: Daniel. "Do you think he's involved in all of this?" she asked, her voice quiet. The investigator paused, his expression unreadable. "I think Daniel is caught in something bigger than both of us." He met her gaze. "But right now, he's your past, Emma. You need to focus on your future. I can help you survive. I can get you out of this." She swallowed hard, feeling like she was being torn in two. "And if I go with you? What then?" The investigator's face hardened. "Then we take the fight to them." Emma's heart raced. She wanted to believe him, to trust him, to finally have someone in her corner. But was he really the ally he seemed? Or was he just another player in the game? But there were no more choices, no more time. "Okay," she said, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. "I'll do it." The investigator nodded, seemingly satisfied with her decision. "Good. You've made the right choice." As they moved deeper into the building, Emma's phone buzzed in her pocket. Her hand froze before she pulled it out, her heart skipping a beat. "Daniel, I know what you're thinking. I swear I'll find you. You can't run from me." Her fingers shook as she read the message. Her stomach twisted, the pull of his words battling with the need to protect herself. But the investigator's voice interrupted her thoughts. "That's him, isn't it?" Emma looked up, the weight of the moment crashing down on her. "I don't know what to do." The investigator's gaze hardened, his voice low. "You can't go back. If you do, they'll find you both. If you stay with me, I'll keep you safe. But it's a choice you have to make now." Emma stared at the message again, her mind racing. She wanted to believe that there was still something in Daniel worth fighting for. But could she? After everything that had happened, could she trust him? Could she even trust herself anymore? The investigator placed a hand on her shoulder, his grip firm, but his eyes filled with something more. Determination. You've got one shot, Emma. You need to move now. If you stay in this world, you'll never escape it. She took a shaky breath, holding the phone in her hand. One shot, one choice, and her entire life would be different after it. The love that shouldn't exist. Part 13. Emma's fingers trembled as she stared at the message from Daniel, the words blurring with her unshed tears. Her heart ached with the memory of his touch, his voice, the warmth of their love. But all of it now felt like a distant echo. You can't run from me. The words echoed in her mind, the threat of them hanging heavy in the air. It felt so final. But the investigator's hand on her shoulder grounded her. She was here. She was standing in a building with an ally who had dragged her into a world of lies, corruption, and secrets. And the only way out was forward. The only way out was to choose. Her fingers hovered over her phone, but she didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. "What now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The investigator's face was hard, unreadable. "Now, we wait." "For what?" "For them to come for you." He paused, eyes darkening with an edge of something far more serious. "And for you to make your next move." Emma took a step back, panic clawing at her throat. "What do you mean, make my next move?" The investigator's gaze softened, but there was no comfort in it. "I told you, Emma, Daniel is part of something bigger. Whether you like it or not, you'll have to decide where you stand, with him or against him." She opened her mouth to argue, but the words caught in her throat. How could she turn away from him, from the man who had been her everything, even after all the lies, after what he'd kept from her? "How do I even know I can trust you?" she asked, the question slipping out before she could stop herself. The investigator's eyes narrowed slightly, but he didn't flinch. "Because I'm the only one who can protect you now." Her pulse quickened, her mind racing in 1,000 directions at once. The investigator wasn't wrong. He was her only way out. If she went back to Daniel, she'd be walking straight into the heart of the storm, a pawn in a game much bigger than their love. But what if he wasn't a pawn? What if Daniel really didn't know the full extent of what was happening? What if he hadn't been the one pulling the strings? What if she had been wrong about him this whole time? "What if I can't walk away from him?" she whispered, her voice cracking. The investigator gave her a hard, knowing look. "Then you'll never be free." Emma felt the weight of his words, sinking deep into her chest. She turned away, pacing the floor as her mind spun with all the things she couldn't control. She didn't have the luxury of time anymore. "How much time do I have?" she asked, finally facing him again. His jaw clenched. "Not long. If they know you're here, they'll come for you and they won't stop until they find you." The silence that followed felt suffocating. Emma's heart pounded. She felt so small in this tangled web, so powerless in the face of everything she didn't understand. But she did understand one thing. She couldn't go back. Not to the life she'd left behind. Not to the man she loved. And she certainly couldn't trust him the way she once did. Her phone buzzed again. This time Emma didn't even look at it. She couldn't afford to. She was already running out of options. "We need to move," the investigator urged, his voice taking on an edge of urgency. "Now!" Emma's heart clenched, but she knew he was right. Her decision was made, even if it shattered everything she had ever believed. Turning away from the phone, she nodded. "Okay, let's go." They moved quickly, the investigator leading her through a series of dark hallways in the building. Every step felt like a step further into the unknown. As they reached the back door, Emma felt the weight of her past pressing in on her. her love for Daniel, the lies, the broken trust, the fear of losing him. But there was no turning back. Not anymore. The investigator pushed open the door, and they stepped into the cold night. The air felt sharper than before, as if the world had grown even more dangerous since she had made her choice. And yet, as they moved into the shadows, a small part of her still longed for the life she had left behind, for Daniel, for the love that had once felt like it could conquer anything. But the truth was, she had no idea what lay ahead. All she knew was this: she had made her choice. And now, there was no going back. Part 14. The final choice. The city lay quiet beneath the veil of darkness, its streets whispering with secrets that Emma was only beginning to understand. In that silence, she could almost hear Daniel's voice, a soft echo in the distance. And though she didn't look back, a part of her couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, somewhere, watching her every move. But for now, she had only one question left. Would she ever be free? The love that shouldn't exist. Part 14. The night was dense, thick with the scent of rain that hadn't yet fallen, but the weight of the moment pressed heavily against Emma's chest. The fog rolled in like a shroud, swallowing the distant city lights as she and the investigator moved swiftly through the alleyways. She couldn't help but feel the eerie sense of being hunted, like a piece on a chessboard, waiting for the other side to make its move. The investigator led her without speaking, his pace quick but purposeful. Every so often, his eyes would flicker toward the street, scanning for signs of movement. It was clear he wasn't just taking her to a safe house. He was getting her out of the city, out of reach. But she couldn't escape her thoughts. What had she really chosen? The investigator's plan had been set in motion from the moment her father died, from the moment her life had collided with Daniel's. But now, as she moved through the night, Emma wondered whether she had any true agency in all of this. Had she been a pawn all along? Her phone buzzed again. Emma didn't look at it this time. She couldn't. The messages from Daniel had stopped, but the haunting threat in his final words lingered, curling around her thoughts. "I'll find you." The truth was, she wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that somehow, despite everything, their love could still be real. But how could it be when the world they had built together was nothing but a lie? "Where are we going?" she finally asked, breaking the silence between them. The investigator didn't slow. "There's a place on the outskirts of town. It's a secure location. We'll be safe there for now." Emma nodded, feeling the cold weight of his words settle in her bones. Safe wasn't something she was used to anymore. As they turned down another alley, the world around them seemed to close in, the fog thickening, the air colder, as though the city itself was holding its breath. She felt like a ghost, walking through her own life, untethered to anything real. "How long until they come after me?" she asked, her voice shaking slightly despite her effort to sound composed. The investigator's jaw tightened. "Not long. They know who you are now. They won't waste time." Emma felt a chill. The cold was getting to her, not from the night air, but from the realization that her life as she knew it was over. She had chosen a side. His side. The side of the investigator who had kept her in the dark, who had made her question everything she thought she knew about herself and her father. She could no longer deny that her life had been one big deception, and no amount of answers could ever make it whole again. As they reached the edge of the city, the investigator stopped in front of a nondescript black car parked at the curb. "Get in," he said. "We need to leave now." Emma hesitated. Emma, the finality of his words weighed heavily on her. There was no going back. Not now. Not after everything she'd learned. But before she could move, she felt it. A shift in the air. A quiet, almost imperceptible change. She turned, her heart hammering. In her chest, A figure stepped out of the shadows at the far end of the alley. Emma! Her blood ran cold. It was Daniel. He was here. She should have been prepared for this moment, but the sight of him standing there, his expression torn between pain and determination, left her breathless. "Daniel," she whispered, her voice cracking, as she took a shaky step forward. He moved toward her, his eyes locked onto hers. "I told you I'd find you." His voice was strained, thick with emotion. "Please, Emma, just come with me. We can leave all of this behind. I'll protect you." "I swear." Her chest ached, the pull of his words stronger than anything else she had felt in weeks. She wanted to go to him, to believe him. But the truth, the horrific truth that had unraveled her life, held her back. She had already chosen once. But now, with him standing in front of her, it felt like there were no right choices left. "Daniel, you don't know what you're involved in," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I can't go back to that life. I can't go back to you. You lied to me. You kept things from me." His expression flickered with guilt, but there was something else in his eyes, something dark and dangerous. "I didn't want to lie to you," he said quietly, "but it wasn't safe for you to know. I swear, Emma, I was trying to protect you." "But how?" she asked, a single tear slipping down her cheek. "How can I trust you after everything? After everything I've learned?" The investigator stepped forward then, his voice hard and final. "You need to leave, Daniel. Now." Daniel's eyes flickered to the investigator, and a flash of recognition passed between them. Emma's heart twisted. There was history there, history she didn't fully understand, but could feel seeping through every tense exchange. "Stay out of this," Daniel growled, his voice low. "This isn't your fight." The love that shouldn't exist. Part 15. The silence that followed was suffocating. Emma stood at the crossroads of her past and her future, the heavy weight of her decision threatening to crush her. Daniel's voice, raw with emotion, reverberated in her ears, but so did the investigator's cold, practical words. "Make a choice, Emma. Now." Her mind raced, a whirl of emotions and thoughts fighting for dominance. She could see Daniel's face, his eyes full of desperation, his hands trembling slightly as though he might shatter into 1,000 pieces if she turned away from him. And yet, she couldn't ignore the deep, gnawing fear in her chest. The truth was undeniable. He had been part of something far darker than she had ever realized, something she was not prepared to face. She had already chosen once, in that dimly lit room with the investigator, and now it felt like she was being asked to make that choice again, but this time with her heart hanging in the balance. "Daniel," she whispered, her voice barely audible, "I don't know if I can believe you anymore." His eyes flashed with pain. "I swear, Emma, I never meant for any of this to happen. I didn't want you to get involved. I didn't want to drag you into this world of lies and deceit. But I didn't have a choice." His voice cracked. "You're in danger now, and if you... Go with him." He gestured toward the investigator with a sharp, accusing glance. "You'll never get out of it. You'll never be free." The words hit her like a physical blow, but they didn't feel like the truth. They felt like a plea, a desperate cry for her to stay in the world she had once believed in, the one that was safe, the one that held the love she'd always known. But as much as her heart screamed for her to believe him, her mind kept returning to the chilling revelations she had uncovered. Her father's death, the people Daniel was connected to, the corruption and violence that ran so deep. Could she continue to live in a world so tainted, so full of secrets? Could she love a man who might not be the person he claimed to be? Her eyes flickered toward the investigator, his expression unreadable, but his stance was firm. "Emma, you can't go back to him. You'll never be safe. We need to get out of here now. She felt the cold weight of his words, and the brutal truth of it all began to sink in. Daniel hadn't been entirely honest with her. She had known that, deep down. And though her heart longed for the man she thought she knew, she realized she couldn't keep living in the illusion he had built for her. With trembling hands, she wiped away the tears that had threatened to fall. This wasn't a choice about love anymore. It was about survival. "I'm sorry, Daniel," she said, her voice shaking but resolute. "I can't go with you. I can't be part of this world anymore." Daniel's face hardened, a mixture of hurt and anger flickering in his eyes. "You don't understand," he muttered, stepping closer. "You think you're safe with him? You think he's going to protect you? You're walking into something worse than you can imagine." His words didn't faze her. She had already heard too much, seen too much to go back. She had seen what Daniel was capable of, what he had been part of. She couldn't keep pretending it wasn't all connected. The investigator moved between them, his voice cutting through the tension. "You need to leave, Daniel. You're not welcome here anymore." Daniel didn't respond immediately. His eyes lingered on Emma for a long moment, as though searching for some sign that she was still the woman he had known, still the woman he could save. But when she didn't move toward him, when she didn't speak his name with the same love and trust she had once given him, something seemed to break inside him. "Emma," his voice was barely a whisper, "I will always love you. You're the only good thing I ever had." Emma didn't know what to say. She wanted to reach out, to comfort him, to tell him that things could be different, that they could be together again. But she knew better now. They had both crossed too many lines. They had both made choices that couldn't be undone. "I'll never forget you," she said softly. "But this is the end for us." Daniel stared at her, as if he couldn't quite believe what she had just said. He opened his mouth to say something more, but the words died on his lips. After a long, painful moment, he turned and walked away into the fog, his silhouette gradually swallowed by the darkness. Emma watched him disappear, her heart heavy in her chest. But as the last traces of his figure faded from view, she felt a weight lift off her shoulders. The decision had been made. There was no turning back now. The investigator didn't waste any time. "We need to go," he said, voice firm but calm. "Now." Emma nodded, her body still trembling, but the resolve in her chest growing stronger. She wasn't free yet, she knew that, but she had taken the first step toward it. The investigator opened the car door for her. The love that shouldn't exist. Part 16, the city faded behind them, the dark streets giving way to empty roads, and the steady hum of the car's engine. The fog clung to the windows like a second skin, muffling the world outside. Emma sat still, her hands tightly clasped in her lap, the weight of her decision settling heavily over her like a shroud. She had left everything behind, her life, her love, the only man she had ever trusted. And yet, as the car sped farther away from the city, she felt no relief. Just a cold, gnawing uncertainty that gnawed at her insides. The investigator didn't speak, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. The tension between them was thick, but Emma couldn't bring herself to break the silence. She didn't even know what she wanted to say, what was left to say. After everything, after all the lies and deceit, what was left but to keep moving forward? She glanced over at the investigator, his jaw tight, the sharp lines of his face cast in shadows by the dim light. He looked like a man who had seen too much, someone who had long ago accepted the weight of the choices he had made. But there was something else in his eyes, something she hadn't noticed before. Regret. And maybe, just maybe, it was a reflection of her own. "You know, I didn't ask for any of this," she said quietly, her voice trembling just slightly as the words left her lips. "I didn't ask to be part of this Mess. The investigator's gaze flickered briefly toward her, but he didn't respond. He didn't need to. They both knew the truth. She had been dragged into a world she never wanted to be a part of. World that had already claimed so much. Her father, her trust, her love, and now, it seemed, her future too. "I know," he said finally, his voice rough, as though he hadn't spoken in a long time. "But it's the world we're in now. And there's no escaping it, Emma." She exhaled sharply, her breath fogging up the window. She stared out at the dark expanse of road ahead, trying to push away the images of Daniel, his face full of desperation, his voice pleading with her to stay. She couldn't do it. She couldn't go back. But the reality of what lay ahead was just as terrifying. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice small but steady. "A safe house," the investigator answered. "Somewhere off the grid. It'll be secure." She nodded, though she wasn't sure what secure even meant anymore. Could she ever be secure again? Could she ever feel truly safe knowing that Daniel, or someone else, might be lurking in the shadows, ready to pull her back into the web she had fought so hard to escape? Minutes passed in silence, the rhythmic sound of the tires on the asphalt, filling the void. Emma's thoughts swirled in her mind like a storm, but nothing felt clear. She kept picturing Daniel's face, the way his eyes had pleaded with her, the way his voice had cracked as he tried to hold on to her. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that the love they had shared was enough to overcome all, the darkness that had surrounded them. But she couldn't. She couldn't ignore the truth anymore. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The investigator's eyes darted to her again, his face unreadable. "Now we wait. We keep moving forward. You're not safe yet, Emma. There are people out there who will stop at nothing to find you." Her heart skipped a beat. "Who are these people? What do they want from me?" "They want control," he said, his tone cold, almost detached. "Power. And they'll do anything to get it. Your father, he was more involved in this than you realize. You're a part of something much bigger now, whether you like it or not." Emma swallowed hard, her throat dry. Her father. She had thought he was just a victim, a casualty of a world she hadn't known existed. But now it seemed he had been tangled up in it too, a piece of the puzzle she hadn't even known she was part of. And somehow, in the chaos of it all, she was the key. She didn't know how or why, but everything kept coming back to her. "Do they know where I am?" she asked, her voice trembling. The investigator was silent for a long moment, his face hard, as he kept his focus on the road. "Not yet. But they will. And when they do, it'll be a matter of time before they find you. The only question is how long we can keep you out of their reach." Emma's stomach churned. She had been so certain that walking away from Daniel was the only choice left for her. But now, with this new information, the path ahead seemed even more uncertain. She was no longer just a woman in love. She was a pawn in a game she couldn't even understand, caught between two forces far greater than anything she could handle on her own. A loud beep from the dashboard broke her thoughts. The investigator's phone buzzed in his pocket, and without looking, he reached over and answered it, his voice low and urgent. "Yes? No, we're still en route. She's with me. We'll be there soon. The love that shouldn't exist." Part 17. The silence in the car was suffocating as the headlights of the vehicle illuminated the small, isolated house ahead. The world outside seemed to close in around them, the darkness heavy and uninviting. Emma's pulse quickened as they came to a stop in the gravel driveway, the soft crunch of the tires beneath them the only sound breaking the oppressive stillness. The investigator didn't waste any time. He opened the door and stepped out, his movements efficient and practiced. Emma hesitated before following suit, her feet dragging as if the weight of the world was holding her back. She glanced around at the barren landscape. The house sat in near isolation, surrounded by trees that loomed like dark sentinels, casting shadows over the driveway. It was a place that promised safety, but Emma couldn't shake the feeling that safety was just an illusion. "What if they find me here?" she asked, her voice quiet, as she stepped out of the car and stood next to him, her eyes scanning the empty surroundings. "They won't," the investigator replied, his voice firm. "We've set up enough layers of protection. This place is off the grid. They won't track you here." Emma didn't respond. She wanted to believe him, she really did, but trust felt like a distant memory now. The lines between what was real and what was false had blurred, and she wasn't sure who to trust anymore. She had believed in Daniel, believed that their love could conquer anything, but that had been shattered when she uncovered the truth. Now, standing in this dark, isolated place, she felt more alone than ever. The investigator moved quickly toward the door, unlocking it with a key and pushing it open. The door creaked, and a gust of cold air greeted them. Inside, the house was sparse but functional. Just a few basic furnishings, a couple of chairs, a table, and a bed in the far corner of the room. There was nothing inviting about it. It was a refuge, but nothing more. He glanced back at her as he stepped inside. "We'll have to lay low here for a while. Stay out of sight. No contact with anyone outside. It's the only way to ensure they don't find you?" Emma nodded wordlessly, stepping over the threshold. The door clicked shut behind her, and the weight of it felt like a final lock on a chapter of her life. There was no going back. Not now. The investigator moved to the corner of the room and set down his bag, rummaging through it. He was methodical, as if he had done this countless times before. "Rest for now," he said without looking up. "You'll need your strength for what's coming." Emma crossed the room slowly and sank into one of the chairs by the window, gazing out at the dark woods that surrounded them. The moonlight barely filtered through the trees, casting an eerie glow over the landscape. The air inside was stale, the walls closing in around her. She wanted to escape, to run away from the constant sense of danger that haunted her. But there was nowhere to run anymore. Her thoughts turned again to Daniel. His face was burned into her memory. His pleading eyes, his broken voice, the way he had tried to reach her, to pull her back into the world they had built together. But she had turned away from him. She had made her choice, and now she had to live with it. A soft click sounded from the kitchen, and Emma looked up to see the investigator standing in the doorway, holding 2 mugs in his hands. He walked over to the table and set them down, then pulled up a chair across from her and sat. "Don't drink too much," he said as he pushed one of the mugs toward her. "It's going to be a long night." Emma took the mug, though she wasn't sure she could drink it. The warmth of it felt like a small comfort, but it couldn't erase the gnawing anxiety that clung to her. She needed answers. She needed to understand what had really happened, what was coming next. But part of her was afraid to ask. "Why didn't you tell me everything?" she asked suddenly, her voice quiet but sharp. "You've known all along, haven't you? You've known who I really am, what my father was involved in. You knew all of this, and yet you kept me in the dark." The investigator's gaze hardened, his jaw tightening. For a long moment, he didn't speak. He just stared at her, as if weighing his next words carefully. Then finally he spoke, his voice low. "I didn't tell you because you weren't ready for it," he said. "And frankly, I wasn't sure you'd survive the truth." Emma's heart thudded in her chest. "What do you mean?" The investigator leaned back in his chair, his hands steepled in front of him as he regarded her with a level of intensity that made her skin crawl. "Your father wasn't just some businessman. He wasn't just some politician. He was deeply embedded in this world, the one you've just discovered. The people you think you can escape from, they were his allies, his partners. the love that shouldn't exist. Part 18. The weight of the investigator's words hung heavily in the room, suffocating her in a silence so thick it felt like a physical presence. Emma sat motionless, staring at the darkened window, her heart racing as the world outside seemed to close in around her. The shadows in the woods whispered of something far more sinister, something she was now a part of whether she liked it or not. The investigator paced the room, his footsteps sharp and deliberate, as if he were preparing for something. His gaze occasionally flickered toward her, but he didn't speak again. Emma wasn't sure if she wanted him to. The air between them had changed, once professional, now distant, as though they were both trapped in a cage of secrets and lies. "Why did you bring me here?" she asked, her voice breaking the silence at last. She turned to face him, her eyes searching his for any sign of sincerity. "Why didn't you just leave me out of all of this? Why did you bring me into this mess?" The investigator stopped pacing, his face momentarily softening before hardening again. He ran a hand through his hair, exhaling deeply. "Because you're the only one left who can stop it." Emma frowned, confusion clouding her mind. "Stop what? What do you expect me to do? You say I'm the key, but I don't even understand what this all means. How could I possibly stop any of it?" The investigator's gaze darkened, his lips pressing into a tight line. "Because your father's death wasn't just a random act of violence, it was orchestrated, and your connection to him, gives you a power that they don't want to let go of. You have a choice, Emma. You can either help us bring down the people responsible, or you can run. But eventually they will find you, and it will all repeat itself." Emma's stomach churned. She thought of her father, her once hero, the man she had idolized, and the story she had been told of his death. A car accident, an unfortunate event that had stolen him away too soon. But now, that story sounded more like a carefully crafted lie, one that had been spun to protect her from a truth far darker than she could have ever imagined. "What does my father have to do with this?" she whispered, the words tasting bitter on her tongue. "What power did he have? What was he involved in?" The investigator sat down across from her, his face stern. "Your father was one of the few people in the upper echelons who knew everything. He was a key figure in keeping things running smoothly. He had a plan, a way to take down the people who were behind everything. But the moment he started to back out, they silenced him." "Who are they?" Emma pressed, her voice a little stronger now, a flicker of defiance rising in her chest. "Who is it that I'm supposed to fight? And why am I the only one who can stop it?" The investigator didn't answer immediately, his eyes dark and calculating. Finally, he spoke in a low voice, as if afraid the walls themselves might be listening. "They are the Syndicate, a secret group, controlling everything from business to politics, from criminal enterprises to global finance. Your father was going to expose them, and when they found out, they had him removed. But they don't know everything, Emma. They don't know about the last part of his plan, the part that involves you." Emma shook her head, her mind struggling to catch up with the magnitude of the words he was speaking. "Me? What do you mean? I don't know anything about this. I didn't even know my father was involved in this." The investigator leaned forward, his voice urgent now. "Your father's plan was tied to something you inherited, something they want, something they'll stop at nothing to get. And right now, you're the only one who can decide what happens next. You can give them what they want, or you can fight back." "Fight back?" Emma echoed, her voice rising. "How am I supposed to fight back? What do I even have to fight with?" "You have your father's knowledge," he replied, his eyes narrowing as if he were trying to read her. "You have the key to exposing them, but you also have a choice, to play their game or to turn the tables. You can help us, Emma, but if you refuse, they will find you and they will destroy everything you care about, including him." Emma's Heart skipped a beat. "Him?" she whispered, almost too scared to ask. The investigator nodded grimly. "Daniel." A chill ran down her spine. She hadn't thought about him in hours, not truly. But the mention of his name brought the flood of memories, rushing back. Daniel. Her love, her heart, the man she had thought she could trust. She had abandoned him. But had she made the right choice? "What do you mean they'll destroy him?" she asked, her voice trembling. "They already know about him," the investigator said quietly. "They've been keeping tabs on him for a long time. If you don't cooperate, they'll use him as leverage. They'll use his love for you to manipulate you into submission." The love that shouldn't exist. Part 19. The weight of the decision settled over Emma like a dark cloud, suffocating her every breath. The room was silent, save for the soft ticking of an old clock on the wall and the distant sounds of the wind rustling through the trees outside. The investigator sat across from her, his eyes never leaving her face, waiting, watching, as if he could see into the very core of her soul. Emma stood up suddenly, the chair scraping loudly against the floor, and she began pacing the room. Her thoughts collided with each other in a whirl of confusion, desperation, and anger. She had no idea how she was supposed to fight back, what it would take to bring down the syndicate, to save Daniel, to do anything at all in the face of such overwhelming odds. She wasn't a hero. She was just a woman who had been swept up in something she hadn't understood. And now, her only choice was to walk a path of darkness she had never imagined. "I can't do this," she muttered to herself, her hands trembling at her sides. "I can't be a part of this world. I don't even know where to begin." The investigator's voice interrupted her, steady and calm. "You don't have to do it alone, but you have to start somewhere. The longer you hesitate, the harder it will be to escape them, and the closer they get to Daniel." Her heart skipped, a beat at the mention of his name, the fear of losing him cutting through her like a blade. She stopped pacing and faced the investigator, her eyes blazing with a new resolve. "What do I need to do? Tell me." The investigator stood up, walking toward her slowly, his expression unreadable. "We need to gather the pieces of your father's plan. There's something he left behind, something critical, and it's hidden. If we can find it, we can use it to expose the syndicate and bring them down." Emma's mind raced. "What did he leave behind? Where do I even start looking?" The investigator hesitated for a moment, then pulled out a small, leather-bound notebook from the inner pocket of his coat. He handed it to her, his eyes studying her carefully. "Your father's notes. He wrote everything down before he died. It's all in here. His plan, his connections, his last wish. He trusted you with it. He knew you'd be the one who could finish what he started." Emma's hands shook as she took the notebook from him. The leather felt cold against her skin, the weight of it ominous. As she opened it, she saw her father's familiar handwriting, filled with cryptic symbols, names, and locations that seemed to blur together in a jumble of confusion. "I can't read this," she whispered, her voice tight with frustration. "This makes no sense." The investigator nodded, his expression softened with understanding. "It's not meant to be understood at first glance. It's coded, meant to keep outsiders from deciphering it. But I can help you. I've seen this kind of work before. Together, we'll figure it out." Emma glanced up from the notebook, her eyes filled with both desperation and determination. "You're right. I have to do this. For Daniel, for my father, for myself." The investigator's lips tightened into a small, approving smile, but there was little warmth in it. "Then we begin." Hours passed, the air thick with the tension of uncovering something no one was meant to know. The investigator sat across from Emma, guiding her through the cryptic symbols, helping her decode the pages in the notebook. It was slow work, Every word felt like an unraveling thread, each phrase another layer of deceit she had to peel away. The more she read, the more the pieces began to fall into place. Her father had been involved in the syndicate far deeper than she had ever imagined. He had tried to extricate himself from it, but in doing so, he had become a target. The final part of his plan, the piece he had left behind, was a map, a blueprint for how to expose the syndicate's network of power. The locations, the names of people involved, the corrupt deals, they were all there, hidden in plain sight. But Emma didn't feel victorious. Every piece of information she uncovered was a reminder of how much her father had lied to her, how much she had been kept in the dark. And the more she decoded, the more her heart sank, for she realized that Daniel was tied to this mess in ways she had never imagined. "You should rest," the investigator said quietly, his voice breaking through her spiraling thoughts. "You've been working for hours. You need to regain your strength." But Emma shook her head, her resolve hardening. "I can't stop. Not now." The investigator sighed, but there was a hint of approval in his eyes. "All right, let's continue. The sooner we finish, the sooner you can confront the syndicate and find Daniel." Her heart twisted at the thought of him, of the man she loved and the dangerous game he was now a part of. She couldn't help but wonder how much he had known, how much he had been a pawn, and how much he had been willing to risk for her. The love that shouldn't exist. Part 20. Emma's hands shook as she read the cryptic note her father had left behind. "He is the key, but he doesn't know it yet." The words burned into her memory like a brand, searing her with a truth she wasn't prepared to face. Daniel wasn't just a victim of the syndicate. He was entangled in it, a piece of the puzzle that she hadn't seen, a part of the darkness she had been so desperate to escape. Her father's warnings felt like a punch to the gut. She had thought she could protect Daniel, that their love was their salvation. But now she wondered if their entire relationship had been manipulated from the start, if he had been a tool in a game he didn't even understand. The realization made her dizzy. How could she have been so blind? How could she have been so sure of something that was now beginning to unravel before her? The investigator watched her closely, his eyes sharp. But there was something almost sympathetic in them. He saw the shift in her expression, the dawning understanding of the depth of the web she was caught in. "Are you all right?" he asked softly. Though the question seemed almost too gentle for the gravity of the situation, Emma didn't answer right away. She closed the notebook slowly, her mind still processing everything she had just read. The air felt thick with the weight of it all. Her heart was pounding in her chest, each beat a reminder of the man she loved and the terrifying truth that now hung between them. "I thought I could save him," she whispered, more to herself than to the investigator. "I thought our love would be enough." The investigator nodded grimly, acknowledging the weight of her words. "Love doesn't change the game, Emma. It's just a tool. They know how to manipulate it, how to use it, and they've been using Daniel, whether he realizes it or not." Emma stood abruptly, her legs feeling weak beneath her. She had to move, to do something. Anything. She could feel the panic rising inside her, but she fought to keep it contained. She couldn't afford to break now, not when everything was at stake. "I have to find him," she said, her voice hard with resolve. "I have to warn him. I can't let him become a pawn any longer." The investigator didn't stop her, but he held her gaze with a steady intensity. "You're not going to find him on your own. The syndicate's reach is far. You're going to need help, and we don't have much time." Emma's chest tightened. She was so close to Daniel she could almost feel him, but she knew the odds were stacked against her. The closer she got to the truth, the more dangerous. The game became. She didn't have time to think, only to act. "I don't care about the odds," she said, her voice unwavering. "I won't let him be another casualty. Not after everything we've been through. I'll do whatever it takes." The investigator nodded, his expression grim. All right, but know this. You're walking into a hornet's nest. If you confront him now, they'll use him as bait. They'll make sure you're the one who ends up in their trap. Emma's mind raced. He was right. The syndicate wouldn't just sit back and let her walk away with Daniel. She would have to outsmart them. But how? The plans she had uncovered in her father's. Notes had given her some answers, but they were still vague, still incomplete. She couldn't fight them head on, not yet. But there was one thing she could do. She could reach out to someone who knew the syndicate from the inside. She grabbed her phone from the table, her fingers moving with precision as she scrolled through her contacts. There was one name. That stood out. An old associate of her father's. Someone who had been on the fringes of the syndicate but hadn't been fully compromised. Someone who might know the hidden details of her father's plan. Her heart raced as she dialed the number, her breath shallow. The phone rang, each second stretching out painfully. Then the line clicked, and a voice she hadn't heard in years answered. Emma? It's been a long time, the voice said, a touch of amusement in the tone. But it was quickly replaced by a sense of caution. What do you want? I need your help, Emma said, cutting to the chase. She couldn't afford to waste time with pleasantries. I'm in danger, and so is someone else, someone close to me. The voice on the other end was silent for a moment, as if weighing the risk of the conversation. Then, with a resigned sigh, the voice spoke again. You know it's not that simple. The syndicate doesn't let people walk away. You can't just ask for help without consequences. I'm not asking for help, Emma said, her voice hard. I'm telling you I need answers. I need to find Daniel, and I need to know everything about my father's plan. He left something behind, and I need to understand it. Now. The silence on the other end of the line stretched for what felt like an eternity. Emma's grip on the phone tightened as she waited for a response. Finally, the voice spoke again.